At the Potsdam Conference of July 1945, Churchill, President Truman, and Joseph Stalin demanded the unconditional surrender of Japan, with Truman hinting of using a terrible new weapon. Whilst Japan was facing defeat across the Pacific against the United States and intensive bombing of its cities and industry, they still maintained millions of troops occupying mainland China, Manchuria, and Korea. Japan was determined to fight on. On the 6th of August 1945, Truman's terrible new weapon was revealed to a horrified world: the destruction of the city of Hiroshima by the atomic bomb. 3 days later, the city of Nagasaki was destroyed by a second nuclear bomb, and 1.5 million Soviet Red Army troops swept across the border into Manchuria to occupy the jewel in the crown of the Japanese colonial empire. But what finally persuaded the Japanese to surrender? Coming at the end of the Second World War, and in the shadow of the atomic bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria has largely been forgotten in Western historical memory. Being a relatively short campaign in a distant land many had never heard of, at the end of the grueling years of World War, many were indifferent to Stalin's Soviet Union occupying further distant territory at the expense of the Japanese or Chinese. However, Manchuria was always a significant territory, fought over by 3 empires since the 19th century. Its abundance of natural resources and verdant agricultural land made it the key territory of the Japanese colonial expansion in the 20th century. As the power of Imperial China collapsed during the 19th century, other imperial nations cast their eye on the bounties of Manchuria. Japan's 1894 invasion of China marked the beginning of its expansion into Manchuria, defeating Imperial Chinese forces and securing control of Korea and Taiwan. This now put Japan into direct conflict with Imperial Russia.
Their rivalry in Manchuria culminated in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. The war was a resounding victory for Japan, humiliating Russian forces and ending Russian influence in Manchuria for over a generation. Japan was now free to act as it pleased in Manchuria. Originally, Japan increased its industrial influence, building new mines, factories, and railway lines to export the mineral riches of Manchuria directly to Japan. With the fall of the Chinese Qing dynasty, political instability, and later civil war, weak Chinese rule left Japan as the de facto power in Manchuria. In the meantime, Russia had gone through defeat in the First World War, revolution, civil war, and reconstitution as the leading republic of the Soviet Union. After the First World War, Manchuria was a low priority for the Soviet Russians.
By the 1930s, internal power struggles in Imperial Japan led to a much more aggressive and extreme foreign policy. Factions within the Japanese government, particularly within the army and the navy, vied for power. The army in particular was convinced that Japanese power rested upon colonial expansion. And so, in 1931, they staged a false flag incident in Manchuria to justify an invasion. Within months, they had taken control.
From 1931 onwards, Japanese forces colonised Manchuria with up to 200,000 Japanese civilians. The exiled Chinese emperor, Pu Yi, was planted on the Manchurian throne as the puppet ruler of Japanese Manchuria, renamed Manchukuo. Manchukuo was considered the jewel in the crown of the expanding Japanese colonial empire. Chinese civilians in Manchuria were treated with utter contempt, used as slave labour, in horrific medical experiments, or simply worked to death. By 1937, the war had expanded to include a full Japanese invasion of China. Major Chinese cities such as Beijing and Shanghai and coastal regions were occupied by the Japanese. Chinese nationalists and communist opposition, recently at war with each other, retreated to the Chinese interior and bided their time.
By 1939, the forces of the Soviet Union were re-energised and once again cast their eye on Northeast Asia. The Soviet ruler Joseph Stalin had industrialised the Soviet economy and massively expanded the Soviet Red Army. This led to a series of battles and skirmishes with the Japanese along the Mongolian border with the USSR at Khalkhin Gol. Whilst relatively small and far away, these engagements revealed that Soviet tank and cavalry units were superior to the Japanese border forces. Bogged down in China and unable to challenge the Soviets, the Japanese quickly realised that they would have to look further south to build their empire. At this point, the Soviet Union was fighting for its very survival against the forces of Nazi Germany during Operation Barbarossa. A non-aggression treaty between Japan and the Soviet Union perfectly suited both parties, allowing the Soviets to focus on the war against Germany and the Japanese to expand into Southeast Asia. Japan further refused to help Nazi Germany's fight against the Russians on the Eastern Front, and instead focused its attentions on the US.
The war against the Western Allies in the Pacific began on the 7th December 1941, with the Japanese surprise attack on the United States at Pearl Harbor. Over the following 4 years, Japan was worn down by its war in China, war across the Pacific, and war in Southeast Asia against the US, British and Imperial allies. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had gone from strength to strength, building up its military power at the expense of millions of Soviet lives to ultimately defeat Nazi Germany. By August 1945, the Soviet Union stood as a powerful victor of the war in Europe, whilst Imperial Japan was almost on its knees. Yet despite the odds, Japan refused to surrender. Instilled in its population was an almost religious devotion to the emperor and the state, and the philosophy of Bushido taught that it was always desirable to fight to the death for the emperor, and that any surrender was plumbing the lowest depths of shame and dishonour. This meant that the war in Asia and the Pacific was marked by the most sadistic, brutal fighting, with Japanese forces using kamikaze suicide attacks rather than surrendering. Manchuria, meanwhile, was exploited and plundered by the Japanese to resource their war effort. The vast territories were used for distant prisoner of war camps in which thousands of British and American personnel were imprisoned, often under brutal conditions. This Japanese abacus was used to count prisoners during the daily roll call, or tenko, in Mukden prisoner of war camp. It was brought back by Robert Peattie, who was the senior British officer in the camp. The abacus is marked with 2 ideographs, probably Colonel Tasha Matsuda. Senior Allied officers often had the difficult task of working with their medical officers to find enough men fit enough to join the work parties demanded by the Japanese.
2 Americans made some knives and got some money together and eventually made a break from Mukden camp, aiming for the port of Vladivostok, which was then Russian territory. And they were eventually caught and were brought into camp, having been beaten up by the Japs. And the officer in charge said that they would now be taken away and returned to their maker.
After Potsdam, Joseph Stalin saw his chance to grab as much territory as possible for the Soviet Union, strengthening his hand at any future negotiations with the Western Allies. Already occupying much of Eastern Europe, he feared that he would miss his chance to acquire East Asian territory before the defeat of Japan. In a bold move that tore up the Soviet-Japanese non-aggression pact, he set out to occupy Manchuria, Korea, Mongolia, and Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands to use as bargaining chips. 1.5 million men, thousands of guns, tanks and aircraft were transferred from Europe to the east, led by the charismatic Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, a hero of the defeat of Nazi Germany. Operation August Storm was the meticulous plan for the invasion and conquest of Manchuria. In all areas of armoured vehicles, artillery and plans, the Japanese Kwantung army in Manchuria was outnumbered 5-1.
The main Soviet weapon in the conquest of Manchuria was the T-34-85 tank. Its 85mm gun made it one of the most powerful tanks of the war, and its wide chassis and sloped armour meant that it could operate under almost any conditions and was immune to most enemy fire. Only the high-velocity 75mm guns or the large 88mm guns of the German army were effective against T-34s, something the Japanese completely lacked. Other weapons included American-supplied M4 Shermans, light Su-76 field guns, and giant Su-122 self-propelled artillery. The Japanese, by contrast, had thinned out their forces in Manchuria, sending their best troops and heavier artillery to other theatres in China and the Pacific. Intelligence reports of the Soviet build-up were dismissed by General Otuzo Yamada, commander of the Japanese Kwangtung Army, as inaccurate. By August 1945, the once feared Kwangtung Army was made up mostly of reserve troops and teenage raw recruits. Three Soviet army fronts converged on Manchuria. The First Army Group attacking from Vladivostok in the east, the Trans-Baikal Front attacking from Mongolia in the west, and the Second Army Group attacking from the north. The plan was to focus on the industrial city of Harbin in the north, before taking the second Manchurian city, Mukden, modern Shenyang, in the south. Meticulous planning was key to Soviet success, with infantry units supported by engineers, artillery and tank companies on every front.
But as the Soviets were preparing their assault, the Americans shocked the world, dropping the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima on the 6th of August 1945. Their second bomb, dropped on Nagasaki on the 9th of August, came on the same day as the Soviet invasion. Beginning at dawn, the Japanese defenders were taken completely by surprise as the Soviet formations swept across the border. The Japanese defence at first was minimal, with many of the raw recruits choosing to surrender rather than fight to the death. General Yamada had completely underestimated the Soviets' ability to invade from the west and cross the Greater Khingan mountain range, which was said to be impassable. However, as the campaign quickly progressed, the Soviets began to face more fanatical Japanese resistance.
The Japanese made their stand in the city of Mutangchang, a key railway hub between Harbin and eastern Manchuria. From the 12th to the 14th of August, the Soviets faced their heaviest fighting. The Soviets took heavy casualties as they negotiated the trenches, pillboxes and artillery dugouts around the city. This was not ideal tank terrain, with infantry relied upon for the heaviest fighting. Japanese suicide squads would rush forward to attach explosive to the Soviet tanks, although these charges were often not powerful enough to penetrate the thick armour of the T-34s.
For the Japanese, it was an earth-shattering series of events. They had previously hoped that the Soviets would mediate a peace deal with the Allies. Not only were these hopes dashed, but the home islands were now being attacked by the most powerful weapons ever used in the history of warfare. These twin shocks brought Japan to surrender on the 15th of August 1945, but fighting in Manchuria continued.
By the end of August, Japanese resistance was reduced to only the underground fortresses surrounding the border town of Hutao. Risibly known as the Japanese Maginot Line, these bunkers became the tombs of roughly 2,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians sheltering inside. No order to surrender ever reached the defenders. The last Japanese finally emerged from their tunnels on the 28th of August 1945, leaving thousands of their comrades dead inside. The fighting in Manchuria was finally over.
The Manchuria campaign was one of the most effective offences of the Second World War. The Red Army managed to occupy a vast area of territory and defeat an enemy army of over 1 million Japanese troops in only 3 weeks. Casualties were comparable to the US Okinawa campaign earlier in the spring, fought in a much more concentrated area. Today, there remains debate between historians as to whether the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki or the Soviet invasion of Manchuria finally persuaded the hawkish Japanese Army command to surrender, rather than fight to the death. Whilst the loss of Manchuria, the heart of the Japanese colonial empire, was a crippling blow, the use of nuclear weapons against Japanese cities had turned the conflict from a war of conquest to a war of annihilation, a war Japan could only lose.
Soviet forces occupied Manchuria and northern Korea until 1946. During their time, they introduced military rule and even their own post-war occupation currency. Soviet treatment of Japanese prisoners of war and civilian colonists was horrific. They were herded into prison camps, where many died from disease and malnutrition. Soviet soldiers committed untold acts of rape and other sexual violence against Japanese women. The treatment of Chinese civilians wasn't much better. After having endured years of brutal Japanese occupation, Red Army troops had no qualms against the mass rape and looting of Chinese civilians, When Soviet forces finally withdrew in 1946, Chinese Communist forces took control of Manchuria with support from the Soviets. Soviet intervention in Manchuria ultimately helped contribute to the Communist victory in the Chinese Civil War in 1949. This had a massive impact on Soviet-United States relations, contributing to the growing Cold War in Asia. The Soviets also occupied Northern Korea as part of the same campaign, handing power over to the Korean Communists led by Kim Il-sung, along with the T-34 tanks and heavy artillery, to the new Korean People's Army. Stalin viewed North Korea as another useful client state, building up tensions on the Korean peninsula and leading to the outbreak of war in Korea in 1950.
The invasion of Manchuria may have come late in the day in the Second World War, but it is clear to see that Stalin's military ambitions opened the gateway for new political environments, conflicts and tensions in Asia for decades to come.